Now that we have support for application containers in Incus in the form of Open Container Initiative containers or Docker containers, we need a place to store our non-volatile data. And so once again, we want to discuss custom Incus volumes in this video. Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So today's discussion is going to be implementing a Plex media server on an Incus OCI container. Plex can be hosted in a Docker container, and here is an example of a Docker Compose file if you were going to traditionally implement Plex inside of a container. And so you notice here that basically we have our name of our container, the image that we'll be running, network mode is host, and then we define a PUID and a GID, as well as the time zone, and then they have this flag called version equals Docker for it. And then we have 3 volumes, one volume for the configuration or the database for Plex, and then in this particular case, 2 other volumes, one to store TV show content and one to store movie content. And we can really have as many volumes as we want for our various Plex collections. So, and then we have finally the restart unless stopped flag. So we're going to talk about Incus with Incus custom volumes. And custom volumes are a place that you can store your data for an application, particularly for an OCI application, which is by nature volatile, and we need a place to store that non-volatile data. Well, we can either reflect that data back to the Incus host in terms of a folder mapping that looks very similar to what we have with Docker Compose, or we can use Incus custom volumes. So we're going to see how to create an Incus OCI container for a Plex server. And we're going to store the persistent data for the Plex database, a movie library, and a TV library in these 3 separate custom volumes that we'll be creating on the default storage pool. And although we will create the 3 custom volumes in this default storage pool, they could easily be created in a storage pool on another disk or even shared over the network. And I may talk about some of those alternatives in a future video if there's interest. And then Incus custom volumes have the advantage of simple backup as well as point-in-time snapshots, just like containers. So then we're going to create a container called the Plex Files Incus container, which is not of itself part of the Plex application, but it's a utility container which will be a normal Incus container. So we're going to create this standard Incus container to easily move content to the Plex server. And the Plex Files container will also attach to the movies and TV libraries volumes on the Plex server. And that way we'll be able to move data to them. And the Plex Files container will run a Samba server to allow the administrator to drag and drop content which they can make accessible on Plex. And if you're not familiar with Samba, it implements the Microsoft Common Internet File System, CIFS for short, what used to be referred to as SMB or Server Message Block. And now we simply refer to it as Microsoft File Shares. So a Samba user will be able to make this custom or make a CIFS or SMB connection to that movies or Incus volume to manage content. They can drag and drop files into these custom volumes for TV and movies, or they can remove things from those volumes. Here we are at the command prompt on my Incus server, and we're going to do an Incus list just to see if we have any containers set up, and we do not. So in order to make this OCI Docker container run most effectively, I'm going to go ahead and create a network called LAN, which I've done in a few of the previous videos that cover Docker OCI containers. With an Incus network create LAN, type mac VLAN, where the parent is equal to bridge 0. And just as a reminder, bridge 0 was the virtual switch that we created in Incus containers step by step. If you have never created an OCI container, the other thing that you want to do is do an Incus remote add Docker and then specify the Docker repository at docker.io with the -- protocol equals OCI. But in my case, I've already added that, so I'm not going to add it. If you want to know whether or not that's in your list of repositories, you can type Incus remote list, and if you see the Docker option listed here, you know that it's already added on your particular system. So now let's create the container for our Plex application. The command to create the Plex OCI Docker container is Incus create, and we're using a create command because we want to create the container without starting it. We're getting the image from the Docker repository, and the image is on Linux server, and it's called Plex, and we're using the latest tag, and we're naming the container Plex, and then we're setting the environment variable time zone equal to America/Chicago, since I'm in the central time zone of the US. And then we have an environment variable version equals Docker according to the application documentation. We have to set that. And then I have environment.net equals host, which is a variable called net, and we're setting it equal to host. And then we have a PUID of 1000 and a PGID of 1000, which we'll discuss later. We have boot.autostart equals to true, which means that when the Incus server boots, this container starts automatically. And we have boot.autorestart equals to true, which means that for any reason that this Plex server crashes or stops, it will auto restart. And finally, we have -- network equal to LAN, which will present our Plex server on the main LAN. Next, I'm going to create an Incus custom volume by the name of Plex-data, which will be stored in the default storage pool, and it will store the Plex database, which can actually get rather large, and we'll discuss that later. Now that we have that database created, we want to attach it to the container, and we do so by saying Incus storage volume attach default, and we're going to attach the Plex-data custom volume to the Plex container, and we're going to do so at a mount point called /config, which is where the database is stored in the Incus OCI container. And then we're going to go ahead and create two areas to store media. One of them I will call a custom volume by the name of Plex-TV, and similarly we'll attach that to the Plex container with the command Incus storage volume attach to the default pool. The name of the custom volume is Plex-TV. We're connecting it to the Plex container, and we're mounting it at /TV TV. And then finally, similarly, we're going to create a volume called Plex Movies on the default storage pool, and we'll also attach it to the Plex container with the command Incus storage volume attach default Plex-movies, and then Plex container is the container we'll attach it to with the mount point of /movies. And now we can start our Plex server with the command Incus start Plex. So at this particular point in time, it's important to note that we could have created the 3 storage volumes on another storage pool, and that storage pool could have been on another disk. And more than likely, that's what you're going to want to do, because we know that the Plex database as well as the Plex media folders are going to take up a large amount of space, and we don't want to exhaust our space in the Incus default storage pool. Since our data is going to be stored in the movies and TV folders, which are actually on the custom Incus volumes, we need a way to be able to get to those. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a standard Incus container that we'll call Plex files, and we're just going to make it an Ubuntu 2404 container with boot.autostart equals to true, and also the network equal to LAN, so that Plex files will also have an address on the main LAN. Now we want to attach the Plex files container to the same custom volumes that we attached the Plex server application to. So we're going to do an Incus storage volume attach from the default pool, Plex-TV, and we're going to attach it to the Plex files container. And again, the mount point for it will be /TV. And then likewise, we want to do the same thing except with the movies folder with an Incus storage volume attach default Plex-movies to the Plex files container. And again, the mount point in this case is going to be /movies. Now with both of our containers created and started, we can do an Incus list, and you'll note that Plex is running at one address on the main LAN, and it's designated as an application container because it is an OCI Docker container, and Plex files is simply an Ubuntu container that we're going to use to put files into the custom volumes. So let's go ahead and do an Incus shell into the Plex files container, and once we get there, after creating a new container, we should always update it. So we'll do an apt update &apt upgrade -y to take all available updates for the container. By default, all new Incus and LXD containers have a user named Ubuntu, and we're going to go ahead and delete that user with the del user Ubuntu. And by default, that user uses user ID 1000 and group ID 1000, and I want that user ID and group ID assigned to my own account. So I'm going to do an add user on Scott, and I'm going to give Scott a password. Once I add my user account, then the next thing I'm going to do is to install a few dependencies, and I'm going to install OpenSSH server so that I can connect to the container over SSH in the future for maintenance purposes. I'm going to install Samba, and Samba is the Microsoft file server that does common internet file services, or server message block if you've been doing this for a while, otherwise known as Microsoft file shares. And then finally, I'm also installing the Nano editor because I'm going to need it as well. Now that our dependencies are installed, we're going to go ahead and change the ownership of the /TV and /movies folder over to the Scott account. With the Samba file server installed, I'm going to edit the Samba configuration file with a nano /etc/samba/smb.conf. I'm going to move down to the end of this particular configuration file, and at the bottom, I'm going to install some new code. And that will be in the show notes, but basically we have a definition for TV, which points to the /TV folder. We have a definition for movies, which points to the /movies folder. And then we say the valid users for these are Scott and root. And then we also say that they're writable and not read only, and they're also browsable as well. Now that we've done that, we do a Control-O and Enter to write the file out, and a Control-X to exit the Nano editor. At this point, I want to set my Microsoft file sharing password, and I do so with an SMB PASSWD-A for the Scott account, and I will go ahead and type in a password and retype the password again. Since we made a change to the Samba configuration file, we're going to need to restart it with a systemctl restart the SMB daemon. Finally, we're going to exit the Plex files container with an exit, and then we'll do an Incus list to remind ourselves the addresses of the Plex and the Plex files containers. I'll want to grab the address of my Plex files container, and I'm going ahead and doing a right-click copy on that. And then I'm going to bring over my file manager from my desktop system. And on that file manager, I'm going ahead and going to smb:// and I'm pasting in the address that we just copied from the Plex file container. When I hit enter here, it will either prompt me for credentials, or in this case, since my credentials are cached, it brings up the server, and I have the movies folder and the TV folder. Let's go ahead and try to click on the movies folder, and oh, there it comes. Here are the credentials, and I go ahead and type in the username and the password, and then it will enter the movies container for me. So then I have a desktop container with a couple of videos in them. One is called Baby Possum and the other is called Crazy Raccoons. So I'll go ahead and copy those with a drag and drop over to our movies folder on the Plex files container. And now I've copied both files over there. If you have a Windows system, this will occur in a similar fashion. Now that I have some media added, I'm going to go ahead and close both of these folders, and you'll notice that the address of the Plex server is 172.16.1.143, and now we want to go over to our browser. The default port for a Plex media server is 32,400, and so here I put in the address of 172.16.1.143 :32,400, and in the end I do /manage. Now that I have that URL completed, I hit enter and it launches Plex. Now here we have the option to go ahead and log into Plex, and I can say continue with email. And if I don't have an account, it can say sign in with email. But in this particular case, I'm going to go ahead and type in my VMS man at Scotti-BYTE.com. And I'm going to go ahead and put in my password over here. And that should be correct. And I'll click sign in. And so the first screen you're presented with is how Plex works, and it gives you the basic information. I click got it, and then the next screen gives you an option to buy a Plex Pass. Plex is generally a free application. However, Plex Pass adds a whole series of things that you can see here. For example, downloads on your Android and iOS devices, live TV and DVR if you have a digital TV tuner. You add parental controls, webhooks if you want to do anything programmatic with it, and a server dashboard with your history and other information, as well as the premium music area. And they have some other features as well. So it's a real deal, in my opinion, to buy a Plex Pass lifetime membership, which is what I've done. But in this particular case, I'm setting it up on a unique account not related to my Plex. So I go ahead and hit X to exit that, and then I get to name my Plex server, and I'll go ahead and name it Scotti-BYTE, and then it says allow me to access my media outside your home. Normally you'd want to do that, and you'd want to open port 32,400 on your router and point it to your Plex instance, which would be at this address that we came to in this URL. In my case, I'm going to uncheck that, and I'm going to go ahead and click Next. And now what it's doing is it's initializing the Plex database. The next screen gives you an option to add libraries. So we're going to go ahead and click Add Library. We're going to add a movies library. We'll click Next. We'll browse for folders, and we're going to click on our movies folder that we had created earlier and click Add. And then we're going to click Add Library, and then we're going to add another library, and this will be TV shows. We click Next, and we browse for media folders, and we click the TV folder, click Add, and click Add Library. So now we have a movies library and a TV shows library that point to the movies folder and the TV folder. Now we click Next, and all we have to do from here is click Done. Plex has some built-in streaming content even if you don't have your own servers, and it's called Movies and Shows on Plex. But in our particular case, we've added two libraries, one called Movies and one called TV Shows, which are available on our Plex server that we created in the Incus OCI Docker container. And we dragged and dropped two files to the Movies folder. So now I'm going to click on the Movies folder, and there are the two files, one called Crazy Raccoons and the other called Baby Possum. If I click on Crazy Raccoons, it begins to play that particular video, and there we have an operational Incus instance of a Plex server in a Docker OCI container, which is an Incus container, and we're able to manage it through our Plex files container, which gives us a Microsoft file share in order to move files in and out of our Plex server. And so I can turn around and stop this video and go back home here, and there we are with the other content. Of course, in the case of TV shows, we have not yet put anything in that particular library, so it gives you the option to go off and manage other libraries. We could, of course, added additional folders to our Plex server, and we could have added additional custom volumes to manage those folders. And as I mentioned on the outset, it was probably a good idea to not do what I did, but instead create your custom volumes in another storage pool, and that storage pool would be located on another disk where you did have a lot of extra space and would not be exhausting your space in your default storage pool. So in summary, the purpose of this video was to show an easy way to create an Incus OCI Docker container and to manage the data in an Incus custom volume. And this is probably the most modular way to deploy a Plex server, providing for easy upgrades as well as easy backup. And since the Plex server database and libraries can become massive, you may want to create another storage pool that could span multiple physical disks, such as a ZFS file pool on another disk or group of disks. And I encourage you to take a look at the show notes, which may have additional details beyond what I've discussed here in the video. And so the Plex Files container highlights a simple way to use an Incus custom volume for CIFS file storage. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit your notification bell, and we'll see you next time.